Welcome everyone. If you're just signing on, want to say hello, and we're going to wait just a couple of minutes, make sure everyone has a chance to log on. Our chat is open. We're always very interested to see where people are coming from. So please feel free to put a message in the chat if you're so inclined. I want to welcome everyone to today's program. If you're just logging on, we're going to give it a minute or two, make sure everyone has a chance. Our chat is open. Love to have you put a message in there if you feel like it. Always like to know where people are zooming in from. We'll just give it a minute or two. Thanks to everyone who's putting a message in the chat. We're just going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here today. Okay, I think we will get started. I want to welcome everyone and say a good afternoon. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Since mid-December, we've been welcoming visitors to our newest exhibition, To Bear Witness, Extraordinary Lives, which we're offering in partnership with the immigrant story and photographer Jim Lomason. The exhibition features the stories of 14 refugees and survivors of genocide, 4 survivors of the Holocaust from Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Germany, and 10 others from Myanmar, Cambodia, Rwanda, Sudan, Syria, and Tibet. And these are all individuals who found safe haven and rebuilt their lives in Oregon. The exhibition also broaches some thought-provoking questions about the role of photography and film in raising awareness about genocide and atrocity. And we are so grateful to have this amazing panel of experts with us today to discuss this subject, bearing witness through photography and film. This program is offered in partnership with the Never Again Coalition, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project at Portland State University, and WorldOregon. And I just want to thank my colleagues from these organizations, Lauren Fortgang, Amanda Byron-Singer, and Tim DeRoche, with whom it's always a privilege to work with. We'll put information in the chat so you're able to learn more about their programs. The mission at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education is to explore the legacy of the Jewish people in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination, and to envision a just and inclusive world. All of our virtual programming, including today's events, recordings of past events, are offered without charge. We're always grateful for any donation that you might be able to make to support our work or the work of the Never Again Coalition or the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Becca Biggs, our communications manager, Amber Curson, our digital coordinator, for their work in putting this program together today. We have a number of upcoming programs this winter. I'm just going to call out one program which takes place on January 26th, when we kick off our inaugural Herbert and Ella Ostroff program in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's with a program titled The Use and Misuse of the Holocaust in American Life. Historian Omer Bartov from Brown University will be leading this discussion. You can find information about upcoming programming, membership opportunities, or donating on our website. Our esteemed panelists today include Craig Constantine, an independent documentary photographer, author, and researcher, filmmaker Skye Fitzgerald, founder of Skye Film, Roopa Gogineni, a photographer and filmmaker from West Virginia, now based in Atlanta and Paris. I think she's zooming in from Paris today. And John Rudoff, a Portland-based photojournalist and documentary photographer. Their full bios are all in the chat, so you're able to read more about them. And last, but certainly not least, I'm pleased to welcome Julia Dolan, the minor white curator of photography at the Portland Art Museum, who is moderating today's program. Listening to Julia talk about photography is something to behold. I'm always thrilled at the opportunity to be working with her. I'm grateful to all of you for bearing witness to the atrocities of today. Today's format is going to be conversational. We really want to hear from all of you. Put your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat. We're going to endeavor to answer as many questions as possible. So my great pleasure to turn the program over to Julia Dolan. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's always a great pleasure to work with you and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. So thank you for inviting me to this program. Before we begin and I start with some questions to our panelists, I'd like to just take a moment to ground us and center us a little bit in this conversation. We're beaming in from all over the place, whether we're participating or participating through listening, multiple countries, multiple cities, and a lot's going on right now. Certainly you're coming maybe from another meeting or you're performing childcare while you're listening. A lot is weighing on us at this moment. So if we can just maybe take a moment and turn our attention to this really important topic and acknowledge the incredibly critical and difficult work of bearing witness in the past and certainly in the present. And unfortunately, this will continue into the future as well. I think it's also important that we be sure, as we're talking about folks who are in really difficult, life-threatening, world-threatening positions, that we center and acknowledge their humanity as well. If we are witnessing people who are currently experiencing internal displacement or statelessness, famine, war, and genocide, we are often, if we were seeing them in a photograph or in a film, we are seeing them in one moment of their life, not their life in their entirety. And empathy, which is incredibly powerful and super important, I think calls on us to make sure that we also see these individuals in their three dimensions of their past and their present, as well as hopefully a better future. So let's try to think about that as we center ideas of empathy and compassion and action, hopefully as well. And one more point that I wanted to make, unrelated, this weekend I was reading All About Love by Bell Hooks, who sadly just passed away last month. And if you know Bell Hooks' work, you may know that she also wrote beautifully about photography, particularly in the African-American community. All About Love is about love. It's not about photography. But I read a sentence that she wrote that I thought certainly applies to what we're talking about today, about bearing witness. And she wrote at the end of a paragraph, "When we are committed to doing the work of love, we listen even when it hurts." When we are committed to doing the work of love, we listen even when it hurts. And we also look even when it hurts. So I'd like to, with that centering moment and really wonderful words from Bell Hooks, open up with a first question that I would love for all of our panelists to answer. And in no particular order, Roopa, I might begin with you because you are next to me on my screen. And then I would love for additional participants to answer this. What led you to begin this kind of image making work? And what led you to dedicate much or all of your career to this type of photography, film, or storytelling?
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction, and for opening the conversation in that way. It was really powerful, and to the Never Again Coalition for having us all here. My name is Roopa. I'm a photographer, I'm a filmmaker. For the past decade, I lived in Kenya. I'm now in Paris. I arrived at this work I wasn't necessarily initially interested in documenting humanitarian crises. I mean, my initial interest was in a place, was in Somalia, and I was interested in issues of representation of that place. And so moved to East Africa, and of course, Somalia is a place that experiences ongoing humanitarian crises. And so the work that I did, that was always a feature and kind of consistently in the background. I mean, I would say if I were to characterize the kinds of stories that I make, the conflict or the crisis or the atrocity itself isn't ever really the subject, but it's generally about acts of resistance amidst these crises. So before the panel started, there was one of my images of a collection of leaves and plants, which was from a project that I photographed in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan, which had been cut off and is still cut off from food aid and sort of international markets by the government with the intention of sort of starving the civilian population out. And so in this context, people foraged and they farmed and they grew and they shared food, and that was an act of resistance against this genocidal regime. So the story that I photographed is about food culture. So those are the kinds of projects that I work on. More recently, I'm working on a project in Georgia. It's the first project I've ever taken on that's in the United States, and I'm American. So that's been different and challenging in a lot of ways. But I can talk about that later. Yeah, so that's me. Thanks all.
Thank you. And I appreciate your highlighting the work that you do that goes beyond the moment that we often see in the press or online. And that gets to that idea of people having lives outside of and around this moment of real distress that we often see. We don't necessarily see the work that you do quite as often. Maybe need to look a little more carefully for it. Skye, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. For me, I'm not sure that I'm a very representative example of how to become a filmmaker or to do this kind of work, frankly. During high school, our family didn't have running water or electricity, and we drew water much of the year from a creek and either sponge bathed or took a shower at school. And I think that those years sort of living without the fundamental scaffolding of modern life, engendered in me sort of a deep appreciation for the simple ease of flipping a light switch, or the sheer pleasure of turning on a faucet and having clean water flow out. But it also, I do think, created a sense of affinity and empathy for those from poverty who live with these things each and every day. I was able, fortunately, to go on to college and flip a light switch once I got to university, and it worked. But as we all know here, many in the world don't and can't. And I think having that background certainly influenced my path to wanting to make sure that people who are in such desperate straits have a chance to have their stories seen and told and heard in deep collaboration with storytellers, both with and without outside of their community. I think the second piece for me is that I've always found sort of the syntax of images far more convincing than any other medium. you know, I think a visual story impacts people really differently than a written story or an orally driven story. You know, it's one thing to hear that 5 million children have died of famine in Yemen. And it's another thing to see what that looks like and to understand how that affects the families by being in the room, right? And so I liked what you said earlier about empathy, because I really think a syntax of images can serve as an empathy machine. And I guess if I didn't feel that way, I'd be an author in a different medium.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your sharing an aspect of your earlier history before college, and that resonates in terms of connection with those you work with. And I also appreciate that you brought up the idea of collaboration, which I think is something that we will get to as we get further into this conversation. John, would you like to go next? Can you unmute?
I've always considered myself a bit of a curious guy. If there's a rock, I'm going to turn it over. If there's a door, I'm going to open it. And I don't trust darkness. I don't trust black boxes. I've wanted, and I continue to want, to contribute to a public, historical, unimpeachable documentary record of what's going on. My watchword is nobody can say they didn't know. And you don't need to look very far. You don't need to look to the 1940s or the 1920s or the 1960s to see darkness being spread over historical facts. You know, you can look yesterday or the day before and see it. And that's what I try and do. It's extremely simple.
Thank you. It may be simple, but it's certainly very, very powerful. And yes, photography can definitely have a role in making sure that people can't say that they didn't know. Greg.
My name is Greg Constantine, and I just want to, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Judy, the Oregon Jewish Museum, as well as Never Again for putting this panel together. I think I've pretty much have spent my career being really dedicated to just very, very long-term kind of project work. I don't particularly feel like I am a photographer whose skills are best suited in breaking news. I've always been curious in almost immersing myself and embedding myself into a story over a long period of time and seeing where that takes me and where the people who I meet kind of guide me through better understanding that and how to then visually translate that story. I think that over the course of at least the past 10 years, it's been, I'd say 15 years, I'd say that the majority of my interest and the majority of my focus and energy has all gone primarily to trying to kind of explore, I guess, that kind of unseen structural violence that doesn't particularly take on an easy visual translation in a photograph, because I think that at least the projects that I end up working on are the root cause of why somebody is in a situation that they're in is oftentimes something that most people don't see through the traditional media. And so I really just try to spend a lot of time trying to kind of peel away all the different layers and then put them back together in a way that tells a much bigger kind of story. I mean, that poses its problems and challenges of me as a photographer, but at the same time, those seem to be the kind of projects that I end up always being kind of driven to want to explore. I mean, those kind of things that really are about the power of the state which oftentimes doesn't take on any kind of discernible form, and how that then translates down into the impact of a person in their day-to-day lives or a community in their day-to-day lives. Those seem to be the kind of stories that I'm always driven to and that I've been dedicated to the most over my career.
Thank you so much. You brought up the topic of root causes and the power of the state, and power systems like that by nature, and so they often work invisibly. So how does one capture that visually or through language in order to point to the fact that it's working invisibly and controlling so much down to individuals? Thank you all very much for those answers. The next question I'm trying to still form in my head, and so it might not come out incredibly well. So forgive me if it sounds a little clumsy. There's a lot to encompass here with all of the work that you all do. And so I'm wondering about how you may see your role, not only in bearing witness, being present with people and for people and recording their experiences, but what do? You are a human being, and we have, again, systems that are apparently set up, whether it's in documentary photography or some types of filmmaking, where you are meant to record, but you are not necessarily meant to interact, be affected. You're a lens, and you're producing something to bring back to other people to demonstrate what you have seen. And some systems expect us to be as neutral as possible. I would argue that that's not possible, while other people might argue with me that, of course, it's possible, that there's a neutrality to photography or filmmaking because it has that, what we call the indexical quality. It happened, you're recording it as it's happening. But we're all human beings and we bring things to this work that we do. So how do you feel when you're in these places where you're witnessing something that is desperately heartbreaking, super painful, or life-risking, whether for you, but oftentimes for the people you're photographing? Do you keep distance and feel that the work that you're doing is better distance then, so that you can move it to larger audiences later and do work after the fact? Or are there times that you just say, you know, I am a human being, I am seeing someone who needs help in this very moment, and I'm going to break that tradition, I'm going to break that wall, and I'm going to help in this moment? I don't know if that question makes sense. If you need clarification, please let me know. John, do you have thoughts on this to begin us?
Yeah, my watchword is, get the story, don't be the story. So I have to compartmentalize, and I do, to some extent, rely on the camera to be a wall between me and some of the things that go on in front of me. Every photographer I know, myself included, have at one point or another done physical things to fish people out of really bad situations. Yeah, we're all human beings. But I'm not doing anyone any favor, and I'm not doing the situation that I'm recording any favor if I get too distracted by my own responses. I think I should pay more attention to their responses. Of course, I want to get emotionally compelling photographs that grab people. I don't want to just do snapshots, because that's what I want to do, is get people to see the story that was in front of me as I saw it. Yes, some of those things are difficult to watch, they're difficult to engage in, but you have to do this. You're not doing the world, you're not doing history a favor if you let that obscure your vision.
Thank you.
If that sounds a little clinical, so be it. But every one of us has made pictures of difficult things, and if they're any good, if they have any veracity or compelling nature, they have to stand on their own rather than being filtered through my own responses.
Thank you. I appreciate the honesty in that. It's not it's not an easy thing to talk about. And I also want to acknowledge that everybody comes to their image making from different places. And John, I think to an extent, you may sometimes be in the moment, one of the more critical moments of wherever you are, whatever you're documenting, and other folks on this call are making imagery at different points within a crisis or a situation. So other folks may have a different way of approaching it. Greg, would you like to talk about how you exist?
Yeah, sure. I think that if I look back, there's moments where where I find myself in situations where there is where the purpose for purely documenting can take on a stronger kind of presence in what you're doing than other times, where that moment, what John talks about, of compartmentalizing and almost removing yourself from what's happening in front of you to just be able to use your instincts to then record is much stronger at some times than others. But I would say that for the majority of the time when I'm working, it's that, it doesn't need to be a moment of the spectacular when somebody is still in pain. And I find that I work in those situations much more than the situation where something is really, really happening in front of you in terms of that. And I think I would tend to lean more towards answering the question or addressing the question of like neutrality on things, because I'm a human being, and I think that it's very, very difficult to carry a full bag of objectivity in with you when you're working on stories like this. At least I do. So in one way or another, I'm documenting one side of the story or the other, in that sense. And most of the times, the side of the story that I'm documenting is the side of the story of the person who's been on the receiving end of that persecution rather than on the giving end of it. And that comes in with its whole package as a photographer of how you approach things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, like John said, there's always going to be moments where you as just a human being interact with the story because you are a human being, but also at the same time, you are there and meeting people and putting yourself in situations to where you have a purpose of documenting, and that comes with its own kind of set of boundaries that you have to build in the way that you work.
Yeah, thank you. I would imagine that most of us on this call, including myself, have not placed ourselves in these situations. So I appreciate the discussion of how things change and how you adapt and how you do work with boundaries when necessary in order to get the work done, because most of us haven't experienced that. So we don't know. We're told things, but we don't know what it's like to fully experience it. I also want to say I've been calling on people one at a time just to make sure we hear from everybody, because I think what you all have to say is so important. But if there's a question that you don't want to answer, please also let me know. Or if it's just, if you have a different thought or would like to ask a different question, please let me know too. And as soon as I say that, I'm going to ask Skye if you have any thoughts in particular, not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think I feel a little bit differently about this in some respects. You know, in documentary film, you know, Frederick Wiseman, for example, is you know, a pillar in the observational or direct cinema world. And I, for a long time, I kind of fell into his doctrine or mode of thinking that a filmmaker simply observes, right? Without interference, with only necessary interaction in order to capture the scene, only enough to enable the filming, frankly. You know, he has a film, I think it's Law and Order, that was in the late 60s, where he covers white police officers putting a black woman in a chokehold, for example, and he just simply observes the scene, doesn't interfere in any way, shape, or form. So I thought that was what I was supposed to do early in my career as a documentary filmmaker. And then slowly over the years, I had a number of experiences that sort of changed how I think about this idea. I did a film several years ago called Lifeboat, where we were on a search and rescue mission off the coast of Libya, documenting some of the drownings there by asylum seekers who are trying to cross the Mediterranean. And on the very first day of filming out in the search and rescue area, at dawn, we came across over 1,300 people on 10 different rafts floating in the water, and half the rafts were sinking. And so it was a triage situation, and Zodiacs were launched, and you know, we were there as a documentary crew. So we were out on the Zodiac, and as we approached one of the boats, you know, these asylum seekers were getting pushed off the rafts. Sometimes they were falling off. Sometimes they were jumping off to try to get into the Zodiac, the small little Zodiac that can only carry 10 people. And a lot of the asylum seekers, it became really apparent, couldn't swim. And so we're filming the scene, and someone falls into the water right next to us, and they start to drown. And I had a choice. My director of photography had a choice. Do I film that human being drown in front of me, or do I put down my camera and try to pull him into the Zodiac? And so I put down my camera and I pulled that human being into the Zodiac, right? And you know, I don't regret that for a second. We would have had a completely different film, and I think I would be a different human being if I hadn't made that choice. So I've had a number of experiences like that where I personally have just made the choice that you know, I'm a human being first, like I think John said, I'm a storyteller second. And if someone's life is at stake, I don't think I can make any other choice. So certainly my views on this have changed dramatically over the years, sort of slowly as sort of experience piles on experience. So that's my thinking on that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Roopa, any thoughts before we go to the next topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Greg said holds true for me. It's, I mean, I like this idea of neutrality and objectivity, I think is just based on so many flawed assumptions, because it's all contextual and we are no longer treated as neutral people, journalists and photographers and people with cameras. It's, you know, we're targeted, especially in areas of conflict. It used to be that you could have a press badge on your flak jacket and you would be safe, and now it's almost the opposite. So I think knowing that, it's, you know, it's silly to think that we could be above the fray, and that we should be above the fray. And also just, I think especially in areas of humanitarian crisis, access is so negotiated, and who you're with impacts everything, and what you see and how you see. And, you know, for me, so striving for objectivity is, I mean, I think I strive for accuracy and truth and rigor and to make things that are ethical. And that's sort of the best that you can do today.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up ethics perspective, and then also the incredible danger of the work that folks who are recording take in. Thank you all for your very important answers to a sticky question. I'm also wondering, for all of you, you are all at that very action point moment of, or the first stage of bearing witness, recording what you see in front of you. And that's just one point. And then you work with that material. It's critical that that material then gets out to a wider audience, because it's important that those of us who are not in that place and time with you know what is happening. So can we talk about how you work to, once you have what you want to communicate, how do you get this message, these messages pushed out with the hope of affecting change? Greg, can I start with you?
Yeah. I think this is a really important question, and I appreciate you asking it, because I do think that there's, I think for all of us doing this kind of work, or for anybody doing this kind of work, there is, your responsibility lies not only with you making incredibly human and ethical calculations when you're creating the story, but also the fact that when people are sharing their stories with you that are so rooted in a pain and a injustice that most people will never fully understand or experience themselves, there also lies this incredible responsibility for getting the work out there to people. I place a huge importance on finding creative ways of getting the work that I create and the stories that people share with me out to a variety of different audiences. And I think that even though you would think that today with the internet and with everything, that there are all these multiple opportunities of being able to get your work out there, there still are great boundaries in getting stories, meaningful stories, out there in a meaningful way. And I think that for me over the years, I think that the biggest disappointment that I've found in doing the work that I do is that those mechanisms that you would think are there to help get your work out there pretty much aren't. And then that rests on your shoulders to be the one driving how the work gets out to different audiences, which I think that also ties back into this really exciting sense of authorship that people have over creating work, and that sense of responsibility, how you get it out there. So for me, it's a number of kind of variety of ways. And I think that some people, there was a particular time in my career where the goal was, how do you get it out to the widest audience possible? How do you get it out so that the most people actually see it? And I think that I've ended up shifting down towards, how do I get it out there to where people have the most meaningful reaction with the work, rather than scale and scope. Scale and scope is always important, but I find that I get the biggest reward out of seeing people who really engage with the work in a very, very meaningful way. And that can be creative exhibitions or self-publications, or targeted ways of doing something on a website. I mean, those are the things that I feel really end up, to the day I feel like I've lived up to my responsibility and my obligation to the people who have shared their stories with me, rather than just putting it into a space where you're relying on everybody to engage with it. That's kind of my own, calculations for how I've managed to do things over the years.
Thank you. And Skye, speaking of scale and scope, as I was looking through your website the other day, I did watch the interview that you had with Trevor Noah and The Daily Show. So not every film gets that attention. So you may have some insight on how to get word out to people who have types of power, for lack of a better term, that can push the word out and the information out even further.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I think on that talk with Trevor, I mentioned I mentioned this little film called Seeds of Destiny, maybe. But most people don't know this, but there's this, I kind of fall into the tradition of this little film, which was put out right after World War II, actually. And it's to this day, it's one of the highest grossing documentary films of all time, adjusted for inflation. It raised over, I think, $200 million for sort of the orphans who were starving after Hitler's regime was put down. And it was, it's a really shocking film, but it had incredible real world impact, right? And so I believe that, there's this nexus of journalism and activism sort of on the fringes of broadcast journalism that I try to fit into. And so Hunger Ward, for example, which was the film I was talking with Trevor about, this is a film about a human caused famine. It's not caused by climate change. It's not, caused by a natural disaster. It's caused by human beings making a decision to create a blockade over the country of Yemen, funded by our own government here in the US, right? So when I learned that as part of my due diligence, as an American taxpayer, as a dad, I was outraged. Like I hope anyone who pays taxes in the US is, because we're funding this starvation of children. So part of my intent in making the film was not only to craft something that would have a universality to it, that would stand up to the test of time, but also something that I could leverage as a tool of outrage and shame, right? And so once we created I call this the long tail of documentary film. And it's something that I've become deeply committed to over the years. So once it's done, the work really begins for us. And so in that instance, after we finished the film, we pursued the aim to use the film as a tool of outrage and shame. We did a broad swath of virtual screenings for over 6 months with INGOs, businesses, government and entertainment communities to maximize the film's impact. And, it was Mark Ruffalo and David Beasley of the World Food Program and Nick Kristof and Judd Apatow, and I could go on to try to really ensure that our larger goals for the film and the project were met. And to this day, I can say we're still not satisfied. One of our goals was to end the war and famine in Yemen. Now, that's a pretty big goal for a film. We haven't gotten there, but we have achieved 2 of the other ones. One was to support the 2 clinics that we showcase in the film and the doctors, and we've raised $240,000 for those clinics that go directly to the doctors and physicians in the clinic. So that's a very long way of answering your question, but that's sort of the tradition that I work within.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And Roopa, this might not be a direction that you were planning on going in with this question, but when I think about Skye's form of communication, I also think about the work that you do, and there's still images, there's some film work, and there's also podcasting, which I think is interesting because we're thinking about different ways of getting word and getting information out and about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just start, like when I started in sort of the photo documentary space, I was, in Nairobi, and I had to do all sorts of jobs. And so I did radio journalism, I did photo, I did video, I wrote stories, I did everything. And yeah, the podcasting was kind of an extension of that. And, I haven't done a whole lot of it, but it's such a, it's a hugely popular, booming space now. And I find that podcasting and photo often can be complementary in that, like, I can photograph a story and have a recorder on a table or something, and they're not competing in the same way that photo and video compete. So yeah, I mean, I did want to answer actually the previous question that you'd asked, because I feel like when I started, similarly wanted to reach as wide and international as an audience as possible, and thought, if only Americans knew about this, they would be outraged into doing something, and that doesn't necessarily or really ever happen in my experience of working in East Africa, specifically in conflicts that are super, super protracted and complicated, and sort of international attention that way wouldn't necessarily be helpful. So I think now my strategy is, and I, this is something I'm kind of like actively developing in a couple of projects that I'm working on, is I'm really interested in local audiences and local screenings, and trying to find, kind of buy-in within the communities where I made the work, because that really feels like where the impact that my projects could be greatest. But yeah, it's sad to me, because I think as news consumers, we have become sort of increasingly isolationist. It's really like the work that Skye's doing with this impact. It's a ton of work. It's like, that's another job, that's another several jobs. And I just feel like ill-equipped to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, as I was working on this panel, I was thinking about how much attention needs to go to so many different situations, and then just add a pandemic on top of it all. And where people's attention goes at any given time, it's very difficult to channel it toward all these critically important subjects. And that's something we'll get to if we have time a little bit later. And Roopa, thank you. You also bring up a point that we'll get to a bit in the next question with the end of what you mentioned. John, do you want to bring us home on this question?
Sure. I largely agree with Greg and also with Skye. I think the point that Greg made about the obligation to carry work forward, to, as it were, pay for the privilege of recording what is in front of us, with the coin of making sure that the rest of the world sees it and knows about it, and hopefully won't forget it. I think that's extremely important, part one. Part two, what Skye says is equally important, that's almost a job in itself. It's like when you take a picture, that's part of the job. Then when you develop it and process it and so forth, that's another part, and so on. What Skye says is sort of like the last part of the job. From my point of view, I make pictures, whether they're long form documentary or short form recording of acute situations. I publish them. I talk about them in fora like this one. I will occasionally, if asked, display in galleries like Museum and so on, although that has fraught ethical and aesthetic issues. I mean, what does a picture of a nightmarish situation have to do with being hung on the wall of a gallery? But that's a separate discussion. I can encourage people who I have recorded to engage with other journalists, photographers, filmmakers, etc., to carry that work forward. And all of that is true, but it has to be tempered with this realization. Most older photojournalists will often at some point or other say, how much change have I effected? You know, wars still happen. Artifactual famines still happen. Genocides still happen, and so forth. And, you know, you simply have to do, you do your best. You make sure the record is clear. You make sure it's unimpeachable. And, you know, the pictures that have made it, you know, everybody in the world knows Napalm Girl. Everybody in the world knows Saigon execution. Everybody in the world knows Aylan Kurdi. Everybody. Those are pictures that are generational. You can't expect to do that every day, but you just keep trying.
Thank you. Yeah, and if we have time, we'll also get to that topic, John, about things like empathy fatigue and so on. So we're learning so much from all of you, and I'm really grateful for it. And I have so many more questions that we may not get to, but I would like to talk about the individuals you're working with when you are working on your projects. And I'd love to know how you work to center the people who you're working with. And I know there are many different approaches to this. And something I'm personally interested in is trying to get past this idea that people are voiceless. Over time, I've learned that that's really not true. It's just whether or not we're listening or whether or not folks are being given a microphone. Power structures definitely work to keep voices silenced, but I would argue that that doesn't make people silent or voiceless. So I'm wondering how you interact with people who are going through potentially one of the worst situations of their lives, or they're dealing with the aftermath of that time. And how do you counteract the idea that those with whom you are working have no power and have no say? Oh, and I should perhaps choose someone. Let's see, Roopa.
I think in the context in which I work, I'm not usually doing kind of breaking news frontline stuff. So, you know, there's kind of acute crisis, but it's not, there's also life. There's a lot of life, and that's sort of what I'm documenting. And so for me, a consistent thing that I do is a lot of the work that I do is really funny. Like most of the films, they're really funny. And that's really important to me because some of the, you know, some of like the funniest and darkest humor is in Mogadishu and or in, you know, amidst these crises in which there's a lot of light. There, you know, there's extremes. And so that to me is really important, is to sort of show the fullness and all of the texture of people's experience in these situations. Another thing that I do a lot, and it started out of necessity, is I give people cameras, and a lot of the films that I make are collaborative in that way, because often, like when I'm with them, I'm a danger to them, and so for them to have a camera on their own is safer. So that in that way, I try and make the kind of authorial process as collaborative and co-created as possible.
Thank you so much. And I just want to do a time check for everybody. It's 12:54 Pacific. And I'm saying that because I know our time is growing short. And I would love to hear from everybody, but it's possible that not everyone feels the need to maybe answer this question. Is there anybody who wants to hop in and? Greg, maybe?
I'll go if no one else is going to. This is such a fascinating question. I really love this. I often work in a space where fellow journalists or filmmakers are under duress to get their own stories out without being imprisoned or killed, frankly. And so oftentimes I'm working as an ally after I'm invited in to collaborate with them, right? Because like in Yemen, for example, where the last project was that I shot, you know, journalists are disappeared all the time. They're killed all the time. They're imprisoned all the time. And you know, one of my field producers actually, after we filmed that project, was doing a story with a French journalist, and some of the powers on the ground, some of the warlords didn't want it told, and he was imprisoned and tortured for 6 months for simply being a journalist, for doing the story. So that's the context often that I'm sort of, that dynamic is very nuanced. For me, if I'm invited into one of these contexts, it's all about relationship. And Roopa, what you said about collaboration just rings really, really true for me as well. And so, you know, I don't fall into this camp of believing that consent consists of signing a form. I think it's much deeper and long-term than that. And I use a term called active consent, where, you know, we were working in a therapeutic feeding center, which is a facility where famine-stricken children are treated as the last resort if they're about to pass from famine. And so long before we went to Yemen, we built relationships with the physicians in that facility. And then the first thing we did when we were in country was not to film, but to go to every single family that was in that facility at the time who had a child and just have conversations and share what we were doing, ask them about their experiences, answer all their questions, and just to suss out what they would like done about the facility in the media, right? And then after many, many conversations, we finally asked the question, do you want to collaborate with us or not? We didn't shove a form in their face, ask them to sign it. We said, do you want to collaborate on this project? And the ones that did, you know, those were sort of in our little notebook of the people that we would film with, and the ones who weren't, we wouldn't. And anytime, so we just avoided certain rooms. And if we happened to catch someone on camera, we would delete that clip and just wouldn't use it. So, but that's active, right? Just because they said, yes, they want to collaborate once, that's that day, that moment. And so for us, it was each and every day, you re-ask that question in some form or fashion to learn whether they still want to collaborate. And that's just our process. And it's really the only way that I can operate in contexts where it's life or death, right? Because children were dying in front of us almost on a daily basis.
Thank you. Yeah, that active.
I hope you don't mind if I could expand on what Skye said, and
yes,
same
please.
thing with Roopa, because I think, like, I totally agree with both of them. I think one thing that you almost have to sometimes factor into all of this is that, you know, so take for example, the projects that I work on, the stories that I work on, they're never done on assignment for anybody. I have no deadline. I don't have the pressure of having to file pictures to meet a specific editor's demands or needs. I fund everything through grants, fellowships, and everything. And that's been a conscious choice that I've made, because I like to work really slow, and I like to be flexible in the way that I work without any kind of, again, oftentimes, I don't want to say without any kind of deadline, but also it's like, I just want to be able to immerse myself in something and see where it takes me. And as a result of that, it almost allows you a different way of engaging with people and collaborating. One of the ways that I've always found for me that pushes the work beyond a photograph, but also into this really dynamic collaborative space, is that I do tons of audio interviews. I mean, I record people talking all the time with conversations that I have with them. And oftentimes it'll be an hour of talking with somebody before I even take the camera out of my bag and start thinking about how to make pictures, because it creates a whole different relationship. And I've found that over this particular part of my career, I'm excited about, I think what I kind of just say are like more photo testimonial essays than just photo essays. And that to me is a really exciting space to be in, simply because I have the time to be able to work on the projects that I work within the time frame that I have. And I recognize that that's not a luxury that a lot of my peers have because of the work that they're doing. So in so many ways, when you really think about it, it's like every single photographer's work or documentarian's work or filmmaker's work, in a sense, it's filling in all these gaps in terms of the totality of a story. And when you put all those things together, it fills in this big, huge space about people having multiple entry points into understanding a bigger story in different ways. And I think that's what's so exciting about this panel, is that each of us comes into this with our own discipline and our own set of how we work. And in one way or another, when you put that into a continuum of other people's works on that same story, it fills in all these really important informational storytelling gaps that wouldn't be there if everybody wasn't kind of working in their own space.
Thank you, Greg, so much. Since we're running even lower on time, I'm going to be selfish for a moment, and I'm going to skip to a question that I struggle with. And I realize that I'm asking this question in a comfortable condo in Portland, Oregon, and I am safe and I am healthy at this moment. And I want to see photographs and film images and truths about people throughout the world. You know, I want to be on that chain of bearing witness. You know, I'm also very privileged in being in a place where I can look at that and receive that information safely and keeping my health intact and so on. So as an American, as a white American, personally, how a lot of the images that are sent to us, are transmitted to us, are of people who don't look like us, who don't live here in the United States. I know not everybody on the call is in the US, but and often the photographers, the filmmakers and so on who go out and make this work are not, for many reasons, of the place that they are making the work. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I worry sometimes, while this work is so incredibly important, that folks who do have the resources to make this work, make the work. How do we, it's, in some ways we can't control where the message goes once we've created the message. So how do we do this work without reinforcing colonial systems or racist systems where we go to another country and we do this work and we come back? And because it's possible that this type of work can reinforce the otherness, for lack of a better word, of other people. So I imagine you think about this when you're doing your work, right? And do you have thoughts on my not very well put together question about how you balance that need to do this very important work with the reality of coming from a more privileged place? And John, I think I saw your finger go up.
I'll take that. With respect, I disagree completely, because recording and engagement of a situation and with a group of people, if one is reasonably compassionate, honest, skilled, and energetic, to some extent is locale neutral. I have done photography in some of the poorest countries in the world and some of the richest. And they are motivated by the same goals, and they're done with the same mechanisms. I could be blind on this, but I doubt it. I don't think I'm enforcing American exceptionalism or colonialism, because I've made similar types of pictures, a mile from where I'm sitting right now and 10,000 miles from where I'm sitting right now. I think the relevant variable is not my nationality or how much money I have, but how much honesty and clarity I'm willing to put into the work.
Thanks. I appreciate the honesty. I'm sure everybody else does as well. Anybody else like to try to take this one on?
Sure. I'm going to say something that's probably very non-PC, and we'll just see where it goes. My issue with this paradigm that you expressed is, in a larger sense, I think as soon as we start to dictate who can tell what story, I feel like we begin to sort of eviscerate the very foundation of creative storytelling. And I think the danger is that it can become a form of self-censorship. And if it does, then in the end, I think that hurts us all by dictating what kind of story is told and why. And I also think it can actually endanger the growth of cross-cultural empathy. You know, think about Chloe Zhao, for example. Does she have the right to tell a story based on a native reservation in the US, like she did with Songs My Father Taught Me in the rural west of the US? She's a Chinese woman from a billionaire family in China, right? And yet she does really powerful work here in the US, right? Does this mean that Nick Kristof should only tell stories about Oregon, or Werner Herzog shouldn't tell the story of Grizzly Man? I mean, we can all come up with examples, right? To me, it comes down to sort of the notion of trust and collaboration, and are you being invited into that community? Are you wanted there? Have you taken the time to build those relationships? So there, I said it. I'm sure many people would disagree with me, but that's where I stand on that.
Trust and collaboration. I'm glad you brought that up. Are you wanted there? Yeah, it's an excellent question. Roopa, I think I see your
yeah, I mean, I generally, I think there's a lot of truth in what Skye just said. I mean, I don't want to be stuck telling stories about South Asians in West Virginia, because I would get bored really quickly and run out of stories pretty fast. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I think the idea of limiting ourselves to our own personal experiences, it's limiting and unnecessary. But I do think it requires more work when you go outside of what you know. I've thought a lot about parachute journalism and what the role of international correspondents and photographers and filmmakers should be. And I think there is a very important role. I mean, a very concrete example is a few years ago, I was in South Sudan with Christoph, and we were reporting on massacres that the South Sudanese army had committed of civilians. And that was a story that had a South Sudanese journalist reported and published that, they would have been, I mean, they wouldn't have been able to, they would have been immediately arrested. And we were able to leave. And the only thing that happened was, like, I had a hard time getting a visa the next time I applied. And so those are cases in which it feels like foreign journalists and people with privilege have a very clear role and responsibility. But I think simultaneously we need to acknowledge that there are places where we maybe aren't so necessary, and work on and figuring out who is there, because there are loads of journalists and photographers in these crises who are, the term citizen journalist, I feel like, is problematic in a lot of ways, because it implies that they are not professional, and the work that they create is somehow less than. But that I don't think that's necessarily true, and there's ways of verifying these days. So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. Greg?
I mean, I think that, you know, that it's a common word that comes up in both of how people have been addressing both of these last two questions. I mean, I do think that collaboration is such a key part of this, you know, and I can't think of anything more exciting than than working and learning from the people who I'm working with on to create these stories. Because I come away walking with something completely new, and also at the same time, you know, the finished product of how that story is being told is being in so many ways shaped and molded by that particular collaboration, and I think that comes from the power of different people with different backgrounds trying to tell a story together. That's basically what it comes down to. And when you try to remove one of those ingredients because of sensitivities like this, then sometimes it doesn't work to the full power of what type of story can be told. So.
Well, thank you all for being so gracious in answering that question. I know it's a tough one, and it's, like I said, it's one that I wrestle with. So it was important for me and hopefully for others to hear your perspectives on that. I am so grateful for all of your time and information. And Judy has hopped on. We potentially have
one question.
It sounds like we have one question from the.
And I'd love to ask you. I'm so sorry. Well, I'm not sorry because the panel was absolutely fantastic. But I think a question that did come in from the audience is sort of a continuation of this really kind of difficult question that Julia posed, but and it goes to the people that you're photographing, and how do you, so you've done your project, you're finished, how do you provide access to the people who are in your photos? Oh, I will ask Roopa to start since she's right there on my screen.
I usually travel with a Polaroid camera and take pictures that I give to people because I find it's often really hard to get back to where I've worked. And so actually printing and bringing images back is not usually very realistic. So that is something I do. And if they have a WhatsApp, then I always WhatsApp people photos.
Great. Anybody else want to share their experiences?
For me, it's because I have this long tail of documentary film that I engage with on every project. I have to have ways of communicating with those that I've filmed with, and so because I need to show them the cut of the film, for example, at the very least, right? And so I always make sure that I have a WhatsApp number at minimum to contact them later. But because I've built these relationships with them, they're ongoing relationships anyway. Like to this day, you know, every week I communicate with Dr. Aida Al-Sadiq, who runs one of these clinics in Yemen, because we're supporting her clinic with funds raised from the film. So it's just sort of a given that we have these standing relationships anyway. So it's relatively easy to share the project with them as it moves through different phases.
Anybody else?
I think this is, you try to do the best that you possibly can, right? And there's going to be some situations where you're not going to have the opportunity to be able to share as much as you would like, but there are other opportunities. And I think, again, this kind of goes back to, because I really work on long-term projects, I often am going back to see people over and over and over again on multiple times, or having multiple conversations with them. And usually because of that, I'll end up taking pictures back and sharing photographs with people, or because of technology now, trying to share web links to where people can see the stories that are online or whatever it is. But, I guess you just try to do the best you can. And fortunately, technology has opened up new ways of being able to do it through WhatsApp or Signal or whatever. But yeah, same thing with me. So.
Yeah, again, I want to sort of underline what Greg says. And, as long as there is any kind of electronic communication, WhatsApp or Signal or, a cell phone with a number, I can get back to people. That is really very, very difficult in some of the places we've all worked. It would be wonderful to be able to give people pictures. I've done that a very few times. I wish I'd done it more. But, you know, as Roopa says, you know, you can't get back there. But yeah, I think Greg has the right answer.
Also, just one more thing. I also think that Roopa said something that was really, really, I think, important in a couple of questions ago. And that was, you know, we always have this tendency to always be forced to think into the globally, but also at the same time, what you can do locally can be just as powerful. And finding out creative ways. And even though I know that there's often situations where you, because of security or because of the political situation, it'll be really difficult to be able to present the work as a body of work in that particular place. The reality of it is, I think it's more important now for people to be thinking about how we can take our work and present it locally in kind of creative ways, because I think that I've found that some of the most rewarding exchanges where I've seen people engaging with photographs and with stories have been not when they've been told it at the UN or wherever it is. It's when you're presenting it in a very uber creative way on a local basis, and seeing what kind of dialogue and discussion and debate that work can then trigger in those kind of spaces and with those audiences. And I think that it just also goes back to you delivering up to your responsibility of making sure that the work gets out there, is that presenting locally is just as important now as presenting on a global stage. So Roopa, what you said, it really resonated with me. So I just wanted to reinforce that.
I'd like to pile on Roopa here if I can. You said something about agency as well earlier. You used a different word, but I'm a big believer in that as well. Like giving cameras to your subjects, I think that's so wonderful, because it speaks to the idea of agency, right? And that's something that I try to do on every project within the scope and ability of each project, is to make sure that I'm increasing the agency of those I'm collaborating with on a multitude of levels, right? And sometimes that's production skills. So the first doc I ever did was a doc called Bomb Hunters that I shot in Cambodia. And there was this little tiny group, Cambodian group, which had been going around the country for, at that point, I think it was 8 years, collecting oral stories, and because they don't have written notation of music in Cambodia, it's all oral tradition. And they'd been post-Khmer Rouge recording all of these master singers who had survived the Khmer Rouge and had this audio archive of it. And it was stunning, right? Literally filmed, recorded in villages. And I ended up using some of the music in one of the sequences. And when I asked them what would be most useful for them, what they'd like from me, it wasn't money. They didn't want to license it to me, right? What they wanted was increased capacity. And so what I did for 2 or 3 subsequent years is every time that I flew back to Cambodia for a job, is I did training sessions with these Cambodian up and coming filmmakers and musicians to help them learn how to record better and how to actually film rather than just audio record. And now they're this like stunning little studio in Phnom Penh, Cambodia that has been doing brilliant work for like 10 years now. And I'm not responsible for that, they are, but that really taught me something, right? That really taught me that there's a lot of different ways to engage creatively to increase capacity and agency in areas where you're working.
Oh my goodness, Julia, do you have any closing thoughts, or you're good? All right.
Thank you is my main one. Everyone was so giving of their time and their thoughts and their truths and their realities. And I'm very grateful for that. A lot of conversations we've had, maybe particularly in the past, before the past couple of years, have been a little more surface. And I'm always really grateful to be with people who are willing to speak from their minds and their hearts.
Yeah, I agree. I just thank you. You've given us so much to think about. If we look at the time, we realize we could probably keep going for another hour. And I do want to also just put in a plug for Julia and your work at the Portland Art Museum. I think everybody should everybody in Portland, everybody in Oregon should make sure that they go there and look at the photographs and the work that you're doing, because I think it is something that we can really learn from. And a shameless plug for our exhibit, and John Rudoff has images in our exhibit, so I hope that you'll come see to bear witness, and to John, to Roopa, and to Skye as well. I'm so glad your websites are on in the chat, and they're also on our website, so do look everyone up. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and take care, stay healthy, and until next time, good afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.